All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming in here. I know this is after lunch, so hopefully it was a good one and you've had your coffees. I definitely won't be putting you up to sleep, so it's a packed agenda. So I'm from Kasten. We focus on cloud-native data management. And we have a fairly packed agenda, so it's going to move fast. I'm going to talk about the context around backup and mobility. We actually have Michael, who's going to come in as a customer and talk about his journey, what it meant for him to be able to do backup and mobility. And finally, nothing is really true till you actually see it. So Vaibhav and Michael will go ahead and actually show this to you. So let me just start off with, as a continuity, I think VMware, Gopala did a good job talking about trying to clear up some of the data management misconceptions. And I think the two key points to make out here is, first of all, having storage doing availability or replication is not the same as data protection, and he kind of outlined the reasons there. And then also, you need to you've heard this message throughout, but it's applications that you need to sort of look at when you're talking about the cloud-native data management, backup, and mobility. So what I'm going to do is, while Kasten, of course, works with VMware, I'm going to sort of take a step back and talk about what does really applications mean in this context, and talk about the two key requirements for both backup as well as mobility. So I think, first of all, just to clarify the stack, and if you haven't seen enough stack pictures today, you obviously have not been in this room, so this one I think is fairly simple, and really you start at the bottom. You always need to have some hardware to run your software on, and that's what you're actually seeing out there. On top of that, you typically have your block and file implementations, and those could be both on-premises, and there are obviously many vendors who play in that, as well as cloud vendors. And again, on top of that, you have databases or data services, and I think as an industry, we haven't quite settled on a common word for them, but these include both SQL, non-SQL, within that, whether it's streaming or whether it's graph databases, which under the covers obviously exercise block and file interfaces. But the stuff which is actually interesting is what I'm calling applications on top of it. So I think there was a slide before which talked about it's hard to think of an application which does not have state. And so while there are many different patterns of going ahead and talking about state, whether it lives in the same namespace or a different namespace, at the end of the day, each one of these applications is made up of multiple microservices. And in today's world, it's polyglot persistence, which means every microservice picks up whatever is their favorite database to solve that particular need that it was created in the first place to do. So it would either go ahead and exercise the underlying data service, or it can also directly go ahead and exercise the block and file system. So that's a fairly simple stack, and there's no reason to sort of really go ahead and make it more complicated than it needs to be. And that's really the point. But I think the two key points which Cloud Native brings in is essentially you need to be application consistent. And I think the panel before that did a good job talking about the pros and cons around what you get there, and I'll talk about that. And the second one is in today's Cloud Native world, you need to have the freedom of choice, and I'll tell you what that means too. So first of all, when it talks about, let's talk about backup for a second. So here you need to sort of go ahead and have application consistency, and what I mean by that is if you look at the same stack which I drew, and this is a simplified picture of that, everything in that dotted line is your application now, right? It has your Kubernetes cluster information, your config maps, your secrets, whatever the database or data service might be, and under the covers, your choice of storage system. So you could either go ahead and say, let me exercise the storage snapshot features, whether it's using CSI or whether it's using native. That's the second order conversation. The point to make out here is you need to have a storage system which supports that, and that's a crash consistent way of doing things. A second way of doing things is essentially you can go ahead and say, let me not necessarily have any thing inside the storage system. Let me go ahead and do it at the database level. And every database vendor has a choice of tools, whether it's a PG dump or whether you're doing some kind of log shipping, to go ahead and get a higher level of consistency. And you can also go ahead and do a backup by exercising those tools. And I think Aaron in the last talk talked about how do you get automation into the picture, and this is kind of what's being talked about in this context, which is at the end of the day, to really work in this environment at scale, you want to be able to go ahead and auto-discover all of these applications. You want to be able to go ahead and set the policies based on what the application's needs are, because not all applications and microservices are created equal, and now do they need to have the same level of backup in terms of availability and consistency and storage speed, et cetera. And so you want to go ahead and make sure that you have tools which can actually go ahead and do that in the best possible way and exercise the appropriate tool at either one of those layers which I talked about. And of course, you can mix and match. And then finally, because you have databases and there's no sort of stopping in terms of when that will end, so whether those are managed databases in the cloud or whether those are on premises, the point is you want to go ahead and have a consistent way of being able to exercise and also customize when you want to acquire things. And Canister is an open source project which allows you to go ahead and get that extensibility. From a freedom of choice perspective, when you talk about mobility, I think there are many vectors to sort of think about that. The three key ones I want to just highlight before I let Michael come in is going to be you have different Kubernetes distributions, whether they are in the public cloud, whether it's an AKS or an EKS or a GKE, or whether it's on premises, whether it's Rancher or whether it's Pivotal, Tanzu, as well as from a storage system perspective, like I said, there are block and file systems. Again, you have implementations of that both on the public cloud as well as you have them on premises. And then finally, other data stores. So we talk about databases, you talk about object stores, and this is, again, a very rich set of tools. So I think this is a growing universe, and I think from a data protection perspective, when we talk about mobility, you want to make sure you're not getting locked into any one of these things, and that's sort of really important from our perspective as a community part. So with that said, hopefully it gives you a bird's eye view of what the key needs are.